Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Friday. So you've made it through your first week of the semester. Did you all get the email about President Benson? He has COVID as well. So it's just a good reminder that we need to remain vigilant. And I know it gets exhausting to keep up all the protocols, but we need to do it. So let's not forget and get lax in the process. So today we're going to do our first true lecture of the semester, and you can see our subject today is religious studies theory. And again, the slides are available on the Moodle class website. So if you have trouble keeping up with me as I'm going through the material, don't worry. Not only do you have the slides, but of course, because I'm live streaming everything today, the video itself is archived. So you can go back and watch again if you need to, or think it's so fascinating. I don't think you will, but you think it's so fascinating you want to hear it again. Before we dive into the new material, though, I want to remind you, as it states on the syllabus, that you have some homework to do over the weekend. You have the map assignment. So in our first meeting on Wednesday, I talked to you about how we'll be looking at different peoples, different cultures all over the world. And so in order for us to do that effectively, I wanted to give you a kind of refresher on world geography. And that's what this assignment is designed to do. So if you go on Moodle and you click on the map assignment, you're going to see a map, a world map that has a bunch of red points with numbers next to them. And you need to look at the location of a point and then match it up with the proper country or city in the list below, right? So you'll see Mecca, Saudi Arabia, and you look up on the map and you go, okay, so Mecca is there, that's number 3, so then you put number 3 with that term, okay? So it's pretty straightforward. Feel free to use Google, any other reference source to complete it. So everyone should get a perfect 5 out of 5, and it's due by the start of class on Monday, okay? So not midnight on Monday, but the start of class, 1 o'clock on Monday. So don't forget to do that. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's dive into our subject matter today, religious studies theory. In preparation for our discussion today, I asked you to read a short article called The Case for Religious Studies. It was a little bit less than 2 pages long. It was from an issue of Inside Higher Education. It was available in the assigned readings folder on the Moodle class website. And it was written by a religious studies professor. And what he's doing is explaining why religious studies is important today, why it's important for students to take religious studies classes beyond the simple, like, general skill set that you get from any humanities course, right? Like critical thinking skills, right? That applies to a broad number of courses in the field of the humanities. But he makes the case for things that are unique to religious studies, unique to a course like this. Does anyone remember what his argument was, what he says?
Like different religious groups see the world differently.
Absolutely, right? So religions shape people's perceptions and their sensibilities, their worldviews. So while events are unfolding in the world, keep in mind that different people of different religious backgrounds may view those events in very different ways. What else? Anything else? Why would it be important for you to be aware of people's different worldviews? He talks about leadership, not just political leadership, but let's say that you are in charge of a diverse workforce. Maybe you're the head of an office. Maybe you run some type of nonprofit social organization. In order to lead effectively, you need to be able to better understand the motivations of the people you're working with, what motivates them, what kinds of sensibilities they have in order to be an effective leader. And the author makes the case that in the 21st century, we're living in a globalized world like never before, right? Contemporary communications, the internet, that we are interacting with each other on a scale that is unprecedented in human history. And so the reality of encountering other people with different religious cultural backgrounds is something that no one can avoid, certainly not in a country like the United States. Right? We have over 330 million people in the United States. That's the third largest population in the world. And we have enormous religious variety, but of course, all kinds of varieties, right? We have such a diverse population. And so religious studies is also about basic sort of cultural literacy, to understand others, to navigate this complex globalized world. And I see someone has responded in the live stream. Grace writes that from an educator's point of view, students may be off for holidays, and it's important to understand why they may be out for a day or more. Absolutely, right? There are all these sort of very real world practical applications, such as if you're a teacher, if you're a boss in the workplace, realize that people from different religions may have different needs in the sense of not only holidays, but perhaps certain days of the week that they feel obligated to go to religious services. Here in the United States, we think of the weekend as Saturday and Sunday, right? That the work week is Monday through Friday. But in the Islamic tradition, and Islam is the second largest religion in the world, Friday is the day that you go to the mosque. So if you have Muslim workers, then you may want to make the proper arrangements so that they can have the designated time to go to the mosque if they so choose. So it's important to have that basic kind of cultural literacy in order to be a more effective leader, more effective colleague, and citizen, frankly. Okay. So that's some of the work that we are striving for in this course. And as I said, we'll be looking at religions in many different parts of the world. And the first task for us to tackle is to think about what religion is. If we're gonna, in one section of the course, go to China, and then we're gonna go to Brazil, and then we're gonna go to Egypt, we have to be able to recognize in all these different cultural contexts and all these different periods of time, what is religion? What is religion? And it's actually a really complicated question, and it's one that is ongoing within the field of religious studies. So that's our topic today. We're gonna talk about how one defines religion and how one studies this thing called religion. And so that's our first step before we can start looking at these different religious traditions in different parts of the world, okay? So I've got my clicker here, so I think I have some mobility. Let's start off with the word that we use, the English word religion. I don't know about you, but I'm always fascinated with the origin of different words. And oftentimes when we study the history of a word, we can learn a lot about history, about various cultural associations that people make when they use certain terms. Sometimes terms can have very dark origins. In other cases, words can really be transformed, right? That when they started off, it meant one thing, but over time, it comes to mean something completely different. The study of words and their origins is called etymology, not to be confused with entomology, which is the study of bugs. So what is the etymological origin of the English word religion? Well, we trace this word religion back to a Latin word, religio. And religio means something along the lines of obligation, bond, reverent observance. We might think of it as something like sacred duties, right? Things that, right? It's the right thing to do. You're responsible to do these things. So that's what religio means. But obviously, when we use the word religion today, that's not quite what we mean, right? So the term has evolved to mean something else. And scholars have found that it's not until we get to the late 17th century and into the 18th century, the age of the Enlightenment, that this word in English, religion, comes to assume the meaning that we associate with it. And you and I use the word religion, we're referring to these belief systems with these practices and communities and so forth. But if we were to look at the way the word religion was used in, let's say, the 12th century, that's not the way people were using it. So given that the word religion has only come to mean what we think of it as 200, 300 years ago, scholars debate whether there actually is such a thing as religion. And that's a really weird claim, right? What do you mean there's no such thing as religion? I'm taking a class on religion. What are you talking about? Well, what they mean is that when we use the word religion today, we're talking about a discernible entity, a thing that we can identify separately from other aspects of human societies and cultures, right? That we can say, this is politics over here and this is religion. And so the argument of the scholars is that until you get to this period in human history, and particularly European history, where secularism emerges that separates religion from other aspects of life, religion as a separate entity in society may not have really existed as such. Now that's something that scholars debate. And you'll see in the lower right-hand corner, I don't know if anyone can recognize, but that is an Arabic word that says ad-din. Ad-din. This word is an example of a possible term from an earlier period that seems to correspond with the English word religion. And this is something that academics argue about. Do other peoples in other parts of the world in earlier time periods before this have a word that corresponds to our modern English term religion? Some scholars say, no, it doesn't exist. Right? And they're using that to support their argument that religion as such doesn't really exist until the modern era. But other people, myself included, argue that no, it actually does exist. That we can find the use of this word deen going back hundreds of years earlier for other purposes. For example, in Muslim empires, there were certain religions that had legal status while others didn't. So in a Muslim empire, you could practice Christianity or Judaism, but you couldn't practice paganism. And so there was a legal function to what is a true religion and what is not. So this is something that is debated by scholars. What is religion? When did it really take shape? How do people use this term? How do we define it? And of course, that's a key question if there's an entire field called religious studies, an entire field devoted to the study of this thing called religion. That's what this class is, and that's what I have my degrees in. So these are questions that I spend my life pondering and wrestling with. What is religious studies? So religious studies is this broad, interdisciplinary academic discipline devoted to the study of religion. This thing called religion. And it's an academic discipline. And by that, I mean that it is a secular discipline, right? Religious studies is not a synonym for theology. The word theology literally means the study of God. And in religious studies, we're not doing theology. We're not studying any particular God. We're studying human beings. We're studying what human beings do. Things like their rituals that they perform. What do they believe in? What deities, what gods, goddesses do they believe in? What do they say about those deities? What do they write about those deities? So that's why religious studies is part of the humanities, that we study human expression, what it means to be human. Not from a biological perspective like they would do over in the College of Science, but from another perspective. And religious studies isn't about training you to be a religious practitioner. Now, sometimes I get when I kind of always hesitate when I'm out in public and people say, oh, you teach at Coastal, what do you teach? And I don't say religious studies because then they inevitably ask, oh, are you a priest? No, I'm not a priest. No, I'm not. So I often say, I teach world religions, or I say comparative religion, because once you use that word comparative, people inherently understand that, oh, you look at different beliefs of different communities rather than being a practitioner. Because, yeah, while someone who is deeply religious could certainly take religious studies class, and I've had colleagues who are deeply religious. I used to share an office with someone who, in addition to being a religious studies scholar, he was also an ordained Presbyterian minister. Right? So that can occur as well. But that's really a separate field of study. You go to a seminary for that sort of training. So if religious studies isn't a confessional exercise, right? I'm not teaching you to be a better practitioner of any one religion. If that's not what it's about, then we need to look at religion with an outsider's perspective. A kind of third-party neutrality, where we're not making arguments for or against anyone's beliefs or practices. We're simply learning about them and understanding them. It's not the goal of a course like this to say, well, the Latter-day Saints believe this, and so let's argue against that belief. That's not an outsider's perspective. Likewise, it's not the responsibility of a religious studies scholar to perpetuate his or her own beliefs onto their students or onto others, right? That's not the endeavor here either. Instead, it's to understand people and to try and do it as objectively as possible. So if we're doing religious studies right, it shouldn't matter whether you are a devout Catholic, a Sunni Muslim, or an atheist. If we're doing religious studies right, everyone can participate equally without any problem. Well, how do you do that? And yeah, it's not always easy. That's where theory comes in, and that's why we're talking about it today. Theory's the lens that we use to look at our subject matter together in the same way so that diverse people can all participate together in this work. So I think it's helpful to think about theory as a big lens, almost like a magnifying glass, right? And if you're standing over here and someone else is standing over here, they can't all see through that lens. And so they're looking at the subject matter differently, from a different angle, from a different perspective. But if everyone gathers together, and of course we're going to maintain social distancing in this era, but just for the terms of a thought experiment, if everyone is suddenly looking at the subject through the lens, from the same direction, from the same perspective, then we have a common reference point, right? That we can all look at the subject matter and talk about it, ideally, the same way. That's where theory comes in. That's why theory is so important here. So it allows us, right? Every human being has their own subjectivities, biases, but by using a useful theory, there's probably no such thing as a perfect theory, but there are some that are more useful than others. It allows us to at least temporarily put our biases, our subjectivities aside and engage in a productive intellectual exercise, right? To learn and try to understand about these different religious traditions throughout the world. So at the foundation of every theory is a definition of religion. If you have a theory of religion, you got to have some sense of what a religion is. Now, there's no perfect definition, there's no perfect theory, but there are some that are way more popular than others. And the reason why they're more popular is because they're more useful. They're much easier to defend. They don't have obvious flaws. And depending on what we're trying to do, we might use a different theory. So this is world religions. In this class, we're going to look at different religious traditions in different parts of the world. We want to be able to recognize what is or is not a religion in a variety of historical and cultural contexts. That's our goal. If this was a class on Islamic mysticism, I might use a different theory. because we're not doing the same thing. I need a theory that talks about religious experience. But that's not what we're doing in here. So we're going to be looking at all these different religious traditions in different contexts. We need a theory that's useful for doing that. There are two main types of theories or definitions of religion. There are essentialist definition. An essentialist definition tries to explain what religion is, get to the essence of it. Religion is this. Then there are functionalist definitions. A functionalist definition tries to get to its function. What does religion do? Religion provides solace for the suffering, right? That would be a functionalist definition. Functionalist definitions are very interesting. They're especially important when it comes to things like psychology of religion. But we want an essentialist definition. We want to be able to look into medieval China and go, that is religion. Why is that religion? A, B, C. We want to be able to look at Senegal in the 19th century and say, that is religion. Why? A, B, C. We have our clear features. So as we look at different essentialist definitions, there are certain problems that seem to arise, common flaws. One is that a definition might be way too general. So an example would be, religion is belief in supernatural beings. Religion is belief in supernatural beings. And at first you might go, all right, part of that rings true, right? Because you have belief in, bodhisattvas and deities and angels and things like that. That kind of fits. But I don't know about you, but when I was growing up, there was a creepy old house at the end of the street, and the kids in the neighborhood thought that that house was haunted, that there were spirits in that house, or ghosts, supernatural beings in that house. That's belief in supernatural beings. Is that a religion? Is the belief that the house down the street is haunted, is that a religion? No, that's not a religion, right? So that's an example of one that's too general. The net is cast too widely. It encapsulates things that we intuitively know they're not religions. So we need something more focused, more narrow. But we have to be really careful there because we can sometimes be way too narrow. So what if, for example, we said, all right, so religion is not belief in supernatural beings, but religion is belief in the one God of Abraham. You say, okay, belief in the one God of Abraham. That's way more specific. And that works for Judaism, and it works for Christianity, it works for Islam, it works for the Baha'i faith, it works for the Latter-day Saints. All right, now we're getting somewhere. But then there's a problem. Does that work for Hinduism? No. Does it work for Buddhism? No. Shinto, Confucianism, Taoism, on and on. That's too narrow, right? It's exclusionary. And there have been some theorists who deliberately choose exclusionary definitions because they're showing their bias, right? They want to say that these things are true religions and those things aren't. That's not the business of an academic. That's not our business to make those kinds of judgments. So we need something that isn't too narrow, isn't too general, isn't inherently biased. We don't want a definition that says religion is the mass delusions of the weak-minded or something like that, right? We go, whoa, that's a little biased, right? That's overtly hostile, prejudicial. Likewise, we don't want one that's overtly theological. We want something that is as neutral as possible. Now, admittedly, total neutrality, total objectivity will probably always elude us, but it's something that we can be aware of, that we can strive for self-awareness and to stop and say, am I being prejudicial? Am I being biased in some way in the way I'm thinking about the subject matter? Right? That's just part of being human. So we have to be self-critical. We have to stop and think about the way, the terminology we're using, the way we're studying it, what kinds of assumptions we're making. So we want to strive to be as objective as possible. I see a question has come in here. We have a question. Do you think religion is necessary in order for people to be motivated to behave morally? Well, if you're asking me on like a personal level, I would say no. I don't believe that religion is necessary to behave morally, because we have many examples of people who are moral, ethical people who aren't religious, and we have people who claim to be religious who are also very immoral. So I don't think that one necessitates the other. The last point here is one that's a little less common, but is still worth mentioning, is that sometimes when people try to define religion, they slip into what's called the fallacy of origins. And that means they try to explain where religion came from. And a famous example of that is the father of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud. You've all heard of Freud before, right? Well, Sigmund Freud wrote about religion. He did a couple of books. He was overtly hostile. He was prejudicial in his writings, but he slipped into this fallacy of origins and tried to explain that religion was the result of an ancient tragedy where a son murdered his father, and then out of his guilt, after his father's death, he continued to repent and seek the blessings and mercy of his father, right? So you can see how Freud was kind of like drawing from like a biblical heavenly father sort of idea, but it falls apart very quickly. I mean, it's fallacy of origins, but then it's also it's way too narrow. It falls apart in a lot of different ways. So the goal here also isn't to try and explain where religion came from, just to identify it. Okay, so we need a definition that highlights what's distinct about religion while avoiding being too general or narrow, and that is as objective as possible, as much as it can be. So this is an enterprise that emerges out of the 18th century, the European Enlightenment. I mentioned at the very start, talking about the origin of the word religion, that scholars have observed that the word comes into common usage in the sense that we use it today in the 18th century or a bit earlier into the 17th century. The European Enlightenment is really the birth of the culture of modernity. The emergence of democracy, of natural rights, and by extension, human rights, the separation of politics from religion, the birth of secularism, the emergence of the private and public spheres of life. And it's out of the European Enlightenment that we begin to see people for the first time studying religion free from limitations placed upon them by various religious and political authorities, to begin to study religion in a critical fashion. Study religion in the same way they might study any other aspect of human existence, like history, for example. And in so doing, it's a separate enterprise from theology, right? And looking at the history, the historical development of a religious tradition, looking at who wrote what text and why, what was going on at the time a certain religious text was composed. And this was a controversial enterprise, right? It's still controversial to this day. It's often said that there are two things you're not supposed to talk about in public, right? Religion and politics, because you're going to offend someone. They're incredibly sensitive topics. And so still today in the 21st century, talking about religion from an academic perspective is a bit of a minefield. And it's one that I, of course, have walked many times as a professor of religious studies. So when this type of study began, there were people who pushed back against it, who resented this type of study. And they particularly came from the ranks of the theologians. And their argument was that studying religion from a secular critical perspective missed the heart of religion. Their argument was, like Friedrich Schleiermacher or Rudolf Otto, their argument was that religion is unique from any other aspect of human society by virtue of religious experience, that there was something unique to religion, unlike any other aspect of human society, that was within. It was a feeling that people had. It was this awe, this wonder that people experienced. And that made religion unique So their argument was, no, you can't study it like the anthropologists do, or the sociologists, or the psychologists like Freud. It doesn't work that way. Religion is unique. Experience makes it unique. So there are people within religious studies who really focus on religious experience. But that's not what we're going to do in this class. And I'll explain to you why the study of religious experience is problematic. How do you study inner emotional experience? It's fundamentally subjective. If I tell you I'm sad and depressed, you've heard these words, you associate those words with certain feelings, perhaps feelings that you've had, but you can never actually know what I am experiencing. And even if I write down or verbally communicate some sense of sadness, depression, then you're actually studying the text I've produced. You're not actually directly encountering my experience. You're studying text. You're studying language. So you have to kind of assume that what I've experienced is what you think you understand. And if you're arguing that religious experience is unique from any other type of inner emotional experience, right? That religious joy or religious bliss is different from the joy or the bliss that you get when your team wins the World Series, or when Coastal defeats BYU. Yeah, that's a type of joy, that's a type of bliss, but it's different than religious bliss. How can you communicate that to me? And many scholars have observed that those who emphasize inner emotional experience as the heart of religion also happen to be Protestant Christians. Why is that significant? Well, we'll study Christianity later on this semester, but Protestant Christianity begins in the 16th century in Europe, places like Germany, and Protestant leaders like Martin Luther argued that salvation is through sola fide, faith alone, inner faith, not outward rituals and behaviors, adherence to a law. So Protestant Christianity, as opposed to its precursor, Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, emphasized inner experience. And so people like Friedrich Schleiermacher, Rudolf Otto, by the way, was a Lutheran minister, seem to be privileging their own religious tradition when they're arguing that, right? By putting the focus of religion on inner experience, like faith. And in fact, here in the United States, where today Protestants make up about 50% of the population of this country, we often use the word faith as a synonym for religion. Right? You hear people say the Christian faith, the Jewish faith, the Muslim faith. That's a kind of problematic term, right? Because that's a very Protestant term. It glosses over the importance of outward practice. And in some religious traditions, there's enormous emphasis on practice, like Orthodox Judaism, Sunni Islam, right? That you have to dress a certain way. There might be rules about how long you grow your beard, what foods you eat, ritual washings to prepare for ritual activity. So when we talk about religions in terms of faith, we're privileging this idea of inner experience and kind of glossing over the outward dimensions of religion. And when you argue that religion is fundamentally experience, you're doing the same thing. But let's move beyond that. Does anyone recognize what this ugly plant is here? Anyone know what that is? It's probably better if you don't know what it is. This is called peyote. You ever heard of peyote before? So it's a type of cactus, and it grows in North America, and certain Native American tribes would use peyote because it is a hallucinogenic drug. And they would use it in their religious rituals, and they would ingest the peyote. And so when human beings ingest peyote, it brings about a biochemical response. When we hallucinate, our blood rate and everything increase, our heart rate increases. But within these particular Native American communities, they understood those experiences to be religious in nature. Peyote will have the same effect on anyone who takes it biochemically, But depending on your cultural framework, you understand those experiences differently. So the Native American who takes peyote for religious purposes understands those effects as a religious vision, for example. While someone at Coachella, who's doing it at a Coldplay performance, is understanding that just as a kind of high. So the point is that these outward cultural factors are dictating how experience is understood. So if we're trying to think of what is religion, it's not the experience. It's those outer dimensions, the socio-historical cultural frameworks that dictate how human beings understand those experiences. That differentiate the person who takes this plant and has a religious experience versus just a high. Okay. Here's just another common example of this, right? So here we have some stains. Now, human beings have a propensity for seeing familiar images. Like when you go outside and you look at the clouds, you might say, oh, that cloud looks like a bunny rabbit, that looks like a car. So in this case, we have a stain and we have a burnt piece of food. In this case, it's a tortilla. And particular people drawing from their own pre-existing religious framework, one, like any human being, they say, all right, that kind of looks like an eye and a nose and a face. But based on their religious background, in this case, they're from a sect of Christianity, they identify this face as a face of Jesus. If they were coming from a different religious background, let's say they were Taoists, right? Based on that existing cultural framework, if they see a face, maybe they say, oh, that's Lao Tzu, right? It's the cultural framework that's dictating how an experience is understood. So we need to learn about those existing outward cultural frameworks rather than focusing on experience. So in this class, we're studying religion as a socio-historical phenomenon. We're bringing together elements of history, even archaeology. We're drawing in sociology. Anyone taking a sociology class? Yeah. Did you learn about Durkheim? Yeah. So we're going to use Durkheim in this class. Durkheim is big in the study of religion. And while experience is interesting, we're going to be reading the texts that communicate those experiences because we can actually know the experience of these people. So how do we do that? Well, building off of the work of theorists of different definitions, we have a variety of essentialist definitions of religion to choose from. And some instructors may use different ones. In this class, we're going to be using a definition, and by extension, a theory of religion articulated by a scholar named Bruce Lincoln. And Bruce Lincoln, building off of the work of people like Durkheim, Max Weber, and others, argues that everything that we call a religion has 4 key components. And so if it doesn't have one of these components, it doesn't fit as a religion. The first of these 4 components that we'll see in everything we call a religion is discourse. So it's under this category that we put all these different types of communication, right? Religious texts like the Bible and the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita, the Guru Granth Sahib, theological creeds, the Apostles' Creed, commentaries like the Talmud. That all goes under the category of discourse. Then building off of that discourse, we have practice, behaviors designed to bring about a proper world or proper people. Right? That you're supposed to behave a certain way in reference to what's in the discourse, what's in the religious texts, what's in the oral tradition. And then there are individuals who identify with the discourse and the practice, and together they form a community. Now that community may have different factions, different denominations, different sects. So there are differences amongst them, but they still share the discourse and the practice. And then presiding over the community, there's some type of a system of authority. Lincoln likes to use the word institution. So a classic example of an institution or system of authority would be the papacy, the office of the Pope. So in Roman Catholicism, You have the Pope here, and beneath him you have that hierarchy, the College of Cardinals, the archbishops, bishops, the priests, the deacons, and so forth. And so they oversee and regulate the community, and they can modify the discourse and the practices as needed, depending on changing time and circumstances. So as we look at different religions in different parts of the world, we're going to focus in on these 4 dimensions. We're going to look at discourse. When we study Hinduism, we'll get to the point where we're talking about a text called the Vedas, and then we'll talk about the Upanishads. And then based on our study of that discourse, we're going to look at what practices result. Because the Vedas says this, people that identify as Hindus engage in these behaviors. And together they form this community that is such a size and is located in this particular part of the world. And the people from this community who are in charge of regulating and overseeing it are the Brahmins, gurus, and others. Right? So those 4 components are going to guide our study of religion this semester. The theory articulated by Bruce Lincoln is built off of the work of earlier scholars, right? I talked about how religious studies really has its origins in the 18th century, and now we're living in the 21st century. So lots of different contributors building towards the state of the field as it exists today. There's Durkheim, who we were just talking about. This is Weber. And over here is another guy who's more infamous for his political influence. That's Karl Marx. Sometimes these 3 men are described as the founding fathers of sociology. And I want to just look at some of their ideas related to religion. So let's first talk about Marx. And Marx is going to come up again later this semester because we're going to look at the impact that communism had on religion in China. The rise of the Communist Party in the latter half of the 20th century in China means very bad things for religion in China. The state violently suppresses the practice of religions: Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism, Christianity, Islam. They draw from the ideas of Marx in the 19th century. So Marx was not principally interested in religion. Religion was kind of a tangential concern of Marx, right? His whole idea was class struggle. What is the animating force in human history? Is it something like the human spirit of nationhood, of peoplehood? No, he argued that it was about class warfare. It was class struggle. Reduced to 2 big categories, you have the working class masses, the proletariat, and a moneyed ruling class, the bourgeoisie. And it's the tension between these 2 forces that animate human history. And so he talks about religion from a functionalist point of view. He's interested in what function religion plays. And he argues that religion functions as a source of solace for the oppressed, for the working class masses, that while they're slaving away, trying to survive in poverty, that they find hope and reassurance in their religion that when they die, they're going to go to a blissful afterlife, for example, where there's no more hunger, no more suffering, no more struggle, time of justice. But he also talks about religion as the ideology of the ruling class. So here's where the bias starts to come out a bit more in Marx, right? He argues that religion is a tool of the oppressor to keep the working class masses in their place. And so in order for the working class masses to overthrow their oppressors, they have to shed religion. So Marxism is anti-religious. That religion needs to be done away with. It's a materialist system of belief. Problem with that, of course, is that there are lots of examples in history where religion motivates people to overthrow their oppressors, right? Not just the ideology of the ruling class. Take the Iranian Revolution of 1979. Religion helps to motivate the masses to overthrow the Shah, the king of Iran. It doesn't really fit in Marx's scheme. But what his ideas do highlight is the role that religion plays in institutions of authority. One of the 4 dimensions that I just mentioned was the system of authority. The reason why Pope Francis gets to live in the Vatican and hundreds of millions of people listen to what he has to say is because of religion. Otherwise, he's just some guy. So religion infuses certain people, certain councils with authority. And so with all the faults in his ideas here, he did at this early stage in the 19th century highlight those dimensions for us. Moving on to a scholar who's a bit more useful to us, Durkheim. Emile Durkheim, French sociologist, wrote on so many important things. But when it came to religion, Durkheim was interested in the way in which religion binds people together, creates community. So if you think about what communities you belong to, for example, I don't know if we have any foreign students here, but let's just assume we don't. You're all American. You belong to the American community. What makes you a part of that community? On one hand, you could say, well, I have my citizen, status, right? A passport, right? There's a legal status, yes, but beyond that, you might say, well, shared recognition of the values of the Constitution, shared experiences, shared historical experiences. It might be a linguistic basis, other cultural basis for what makes you an American. But what about other communities? Think about a time in human history before nation states existed, before there were countries. If there were no countries, what community would you belong to? Well, you might say, well, family, by blood. That's one way, kinship. That's where we get the idea of a tribe. A tribe is a community bound by shared blood. You're related to each other. You share a common biological ancestor. But that's limited, right? So what about building a bigger community? Well, Durkheim talks about the role that religion plays in that. That your shared beliefs and practices suddenly unite all these different tribes, all these different individuals into these super communities. The Christian church, the Muslim Ummah. Right? Suddenly you have these massive communities. And that's another factor. Right? We have discourse, practice, community, and system of authority. So Marx brings our attention to the system of authority. Durkheim brings our attention to community. And he lays out this nice definition for us. It's not perfect, but it's pretty darn good. He says that religion is a unified system of beliefs and practices. So there we've got beliefs and practices. Those were the first of the two of the four components, relative to sacred things. And he defines sacred things as things that are set apart and forbidden. Beliefs and practices which unite into a single moral community, all those who adhere to them. So here in Durkheim's definition of religion, he's got three of the four components that we're going to use. What he's missing here is the system of authority, which is what Marx brings to the table. And our last one, Max Weber, has all four. So Weber, and I'm paraphrasing his definition here, says that religion is belief in supernatural powers articulated with symbolic acts, so that would be practice, under guidance of leaders, right? So that's what Durkheim was missing, the system of authority, in patterns of behavior determined by the community. So Weber has all four components that we're going to look at this semester in his definition. Right? Belief, that's the discourse, communication of ideas. Practice, or as he says, acts. Guidance of leaders, so that's the system of authority, and then community. Those are the four things we're going to focus on, not religious experience. We might talk about religious experience, but those are the four things that we're going to focus on this semester. So as we move along and we look at different religions in all these different parts of the world at different time periods, again and again, we're going to look for these things that are going to help us to determine what is a religion and what is not. So if we look at China and we find belief that ghosts haunt this house down the street, that's not what's going to occupy our attention. Right? That's not religion. We want something that has all four of these components. That's going to occupy our attention. All right? So to refresh your knowledge of world geography, complete the map assignment for class on Monday. It's all online. Feel free to use reference works. And we will talk a little bit more about theory, but we'll begin to actually look at beliefs and practices on Monday. We're going to talk about indigenous religions. All right. Thank you very much, and have a great weekend. Stay safe out there, and I will see you next week.